Welcome, I'm Peter O'Brien. During this time of an uncertain economy and war, I felt it would be helpful for us to hear from people who've lived through far worse, the Great Depression and World War II. During the Great Depression, approximately 1/4 of America was unemployed. During World War II, approximately 100,000 American servicemen were killed every year. These two events were far larger than what we deal with today. All 5 people that follow me lived through the Great Depression, lived through World War II. They'll describe their experiences and also give us some ideas on how they coped and how we can cope today, both with economic uncertainty and also with war. All 5 speakers are from the community.
I'm Lucy Jensen, and I'm 90 years old. We found Healdsburg in the 1970s. My husband and I were looking for a place to get out of the Bay Area on weekends and have some warm weather. And that's when we moved here.
My name is Gail Humphrey, and I live in Healdsburg.
I am Ernest Palmieri, 83 years old, born in Healdsburg, California.
Hi, I'm Walter Murray. I've lived in Healdsburg all my life. I was born up just north of Solar Terrace and moved to Healdsburg on 632 Healdsburg Avenue when I was 4 years old. And I've lived there ever since, 88 years.
My name is Nick Pavoni. I live in Healdsburg all my life, and I'm 92 years old.
In 1936, I was living in St. Louis, Missouri. I had graduated 2 years before from Columbia, Missouri, and where I'd gone to school, to college. And this was in the heart of the Depression in the Midwest. And I finally got a job at Sticks, Bear and Fuller. I worked under NRA wages for $13.95 a week. I got commission on a certain amount that I sold over my quota. At that time, we felt very fortunate to be able to move out of really crummy housekeeping quarters that consisted of a bedroom, a little kitchenette, and a shared bathroom. And we moved into public housing that the government had supplied in an area that had a lot of tenements in it, and this was largely an Italian center in St. Louis. And they tore down all these tenements and built this nice public housing, and the people who had lived there wouldn't move in. They didn't like it. And so it was largely occupied by young college graduates who were striving to make a living in St. Louis during the Depression. And at that time, things were really severe in St. Louis. They had what they called Hoovervilles, and people were scrounging in garbage cans and living in just horrible conditions. And because the Depression actually came into the Midwest later than it had hit in the East, and they were feeling the effects of it. You had a lot of government programs going on at that time, in particular NRA and the CCC camps and things that kind of got people back on their feet.
In 1936, I was 16 and I was finishing high school and entering college. I grew up in southwestern Los Angeles, although we had a country place we went to every weekend. And the school I attended was right in the shadow of USC and right where they subsequently built all the things for the 1932 Olympics. As a matter of fact, I had a severe polio in 1928, and this influenced my life for some time, including when I was in high school, because I had restorative surgeries in 1932, 33, and 34. So I went back to school each fall in a wheelchair, and was really lucky to have the boys I grew up with going to the same school, and it was a 2-story brick building, so that there was no elevator. And so my good friends would pick up me, the wheelchair and all, and take me up to my math classes and then come and take me down afterwards.
I lived out in the ranch in 1936, and I was 14 years old. And we lived, things were pretty tough then, but we always ate well and had clean clothes, and worked.
I was in Healdsburg, and I was 24 years old in 1936.
In 1936, I was 24 years old.
After 2 years, which would have been bringing it up to 1936, my daughter was born, and I was 22 at the time, and I worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week.
One of the things I remember truly about 1936 was the impact that FDR had. My grandfather listened to all his radio speeches, we listened to, and because of my own problems with polio, I felt a certain relationship to him. Actually, certain inspiration from what he had accomplished after having had a severe polio. I myself had restorative surgery in 1932, 33, and 34, so I went back to school each fall, initially in a wheelchair, and by the time I graduated from high school in 1936, I had no braces anymore. My mother, being a nurse, was a real tartar about doing the things that would make me get better, and bless her for that. In 1936, I got called to the office of the girls' vice principal of my high school, and she said, "Where are you going to college?" The first time it had entered my mind. Education per se did not have a high valence in the essentially immigrant family in which I grew up. And so she made me fill out applications for scholarships, 3 of them. And to my complete surprise, I got all 3. But I said yes to the first one because I was so startled that it happened. So that's how I happened to go to UCLA. And at the time, prior to that, in terms of responsibilities, it was largely the job of getting good grades. And even though education didn't have a high valence with my grandfather, I never left the house without him saying, "Be the best." And it was not a casual instruction, it was go do it.
But like yours, at 14 years old, was milking the cows, cleaning the stables, and doing the vineyard, some of the vineyard work and orchard work, and a little bit of everything. Go to school early in the morning and come home and work. And later in the day, when school was over, about it there. Try to.
In 1936, I was working in the laundry for my family. I started when I was 18 years old in 1930. And I stayed on the job, drove the laundry truck for 47 years. I worked 60 to 70 hours a week for $20 a week.
I was working for this Water Ranch. They had 1,700 acres, and all we were doing, fixing fences and chasing cattle, and And
Probably my first reaction to the situation of the country as a whole was the fact that I had come out of Kansas in a very stable home and very protected background. And I was absolutely horrified to find out that people were living on the streets in St. Louis, that people didn't have enough to eat, that I can remember bringing home a little dog that we found that was starving, and I was trying very hard to live on a budget and stay within our income, which was very meager. And I make some cornbread one day, and it didn't. I forgot to put in the baking soda, and it didn't rise. And so I broke it up for the dog to eat and poured some milk on it, and the dog just turned its nose up at it and walked away. And I went into hysterics because not only had I wasted the ingredients for the cornbread and put milk on it, but then I was adding insult to injury, of course, because the dog wouldn't eat it. And so little things really disturbed me terribly. I'd never seen children scratching around in garbage pails, and all of this was pretty horrifying. But we were also so concerned. My husband worked as a butcher. He had a college education. He worked as a butcher, only job he could get. And he contracted tuberculosis, and that's when we moved to Colorado.
I feel I didn't suffer any real hardships during the Great Depression because of our lifestyle. Our people came from Sweden and were used to working, and we had on our city lot we had chickens. We had all sorts of foodstuffs growing. We had, orange, grapefruit, lemon trees, fig trees, blackberry vines, grew some vegetables. And of course, I participated in this, like go pick the blackberries for this evening, that sort of thing. And it's just the whole family pitched in. And my grandmother was a splendid cook. As a matter of fact, before she and Grandpa married, she had been a chef for Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. And when they got married, he said, "No wife of mine will work," not realizing that running that family was going to be a lot more difficult than the fun job she had before she married him. But it's
Well, it was working when the hardship of the Great Depression with us was working so hard to save our ranch out in Dry Creek, which we did just by hard work. Tough, because there was no money, no loose money around. It was all in paying for that ranch off. That was a living then. Yeah.
When I was young, I was working over at the packing house. First, I picked prunes when I was real young. And then when I got about 13 years old, I was working over the packing house making boxes for 20 cents a 100. And there was always a bunch of men out in the front office, outside of the front office, hoping that somebody would get fired so they could get their job. And these men were working in the packing house for 15 cents an hour, long hours, loading cars of grapes. They shipped them back east. In the early 30s, I remember my mother had a pot of beans on the stove every day, and she made homemade bread, and there were men coming to the door begging for something to eat. They were hungry, and she never turned anybody down. Sometimes a freight train would come into town, and I'd count 60 and 70 men up on top of loads of lumber. And if the train stopped at the depot, they'd come uptown begging for food to eat. He'd want to do a little job for something to eat. We always felt sorry for him. My family never turned anybody down.
But that was one of the days that when I went to work for him, during the Depression, I got 40 cents an hour. And then the Depression come, he said, I can't pay over 25 cents an hour. So that was it. In 1936, everybody, during the hard Depression, everybody helped each other out. And that's, I don't know what else to tell you, but that was a real Depression time.
I think youth has a way of just rising above things, and so we would have a party. Now we didn't have a couch. We had an old mattress that we doubled up against the wall, and that kind of served as a couch. And of course, we were young enough that we could get up and down off of it, which helped a lot. But I can remember that the first party I gave there was we had spaghetti and cheese and beer. And I don't drink beer, didn't drink beer at that time either, and didn't know enough to clean up after the guests left. I just went to bed, and you can imagine what the place smelled like the next morning. But we overcame those things, and that was, but nobody had ever served these people spaghetti before, and so that was considered a great treat.
I didn't realize that we were keeping our spirits up, but I'm sure that's what we did because we all had our chores and it was a family enterprise just living there. And of course, every dinner at 6 o'clock, we sat down to a family dinner, all 6 of us. And that being my grandfather, my grandmother, my mother, my uncle, my aunt, and me. And every now and then, grandfather's older brother, who would come down out of the mountains where he had retired. He'd bought a Chinese mine, and he was a gold miner up in the hills above San Gabriel. We never knew he was coming. He would just arrive when it was dinner time, maybe every month or two. And so we didn't have a sense of hardship. We had a jolly time. As a matter of fact, everybody at the dinner table had to make a contribution. I mean, even as a child, I was expected to speak about how my day had gone at the dinner table, but never anything negative. It had to be some goodie that you were bringing to the dinner table. So maybe that was part of what kept our spirits up.
Well, to kind of do something, even during Depression, I always had time enough to go do a little fishing in Dry Creek, a little rabbit hunting, this and that. Kind of enjoyed it, stuff, and go mushroom hunting and stuff like that, with kids. That was kind of been a party, I think. Yeah.
When I had the time off from work on a Sunday afternoon, I used to chase the women.
During Depression spirit, all I was doing was playing golf and helping each other out.
I have 5 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren, and my advice to them is that they really, really need to be politically active, because they're going to, if they're taken in by what's going to happen to Social Security, what's going to happen to the taxes they're going to be facing, they're going to face real hardships. The other thing is that I think that quality time spent with your children is the most important thing in the world. And you can get out and you can play baseball with them, you can do games at home at night, And these are the things that are valued, and forget about all the electronic toys and all, have to have all the name brands of this jacket or somebody else's skateboard. And just remember that the time you spend with your children is the most valuable thing in the world, and that goes for teenagers too. You can go on hikes, you can go camping, you can get them away from the peer pressure. And I think that's would be my advice.
I was interested in your question about people who are facing economic hardship today. And from my own experience, I'd say doing for yourselves as an individual and as a family, and learning of the aids and assistances that are out there for you, networking with your friends, volunteering, because that way you might get a job or a better job, and save in how you live. That means don't go eating out when you could do something as much fun at home. There are many ways that can eat a hole in your pocket that you can plug if you think about it.
Well, I'd advise them just not to give up, just keep on trying, because a lot of time that works, you know. They'll come out of the bad spot. They try hard enough.
You asked me what advice I'd give to people with economic hardships. If it was me, I'd throw all my credit cards in the garbage.
In 1943, as a result of the war and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we had moved to San Francisco, because of the war work, and there was so much work up there. And we lived in San Francisco on Montgomery and Green Street, and that was the only housing we could find because practically nobody would rent to anybody that had children at that time. And this was an Italian neighborhood, and they appreciated families, so we were able to rent an apartment there. And it was great. If you went up on the roof, you have one of the finest views in all of San Francisco. But my son had been born in 1941, right at the time of Pearl Harbor. And so by the time we moved to San Francisco, all the government rules for how much sugar you could have, how much meat you could buy, you were on coupons. And he was a great asset because we got coupons for him, and of course he didn't need those things. Unfortunately, he was also a very, very big baby. And Green and Montgomery is on one of the steepest hills in all of San Francisco. And I had to walk down to the grocery store and the meat markets, which were all separate. They were little stores. And I had to carry him. I actually had a buggy that I could push him down in, but you couldn't push it back up the hills, so I ended up carrying him on a hip. It was great for the figure, but kind of hard on the breathing.
In 1943, I was completing a year of teaching for the, 2 years actually, of teaching for the Los Angeles City Schools. In the west end of the San Fernando Valley, in Walnut Grove, where all of my students were Hispanic. This was not considered a disadvantage in those days, although it was hard to get them into class in the fall semester because they were all out picking walnuts.
In 1943, I was in a tank division in Fort Smith, Arkansas. I spent about a year there before I transferred into the Air Force and got on the flying crew there in the Air Force. That's what happened there.
You asked me what I was doing during the war, or when the war started. I was over to my ranch hunting quail with my father and a friend from San Francisco. And we got back about noontime, And my mother and sister told us that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. And my brother-in-law had come to have dinner with us, and he and my father said, well, it won't take us long to lick them. Their ships are made of cardboard. Well, it took us quite a few years to lick them.
1943, I was living in Healdsburg.
I went to work for the public housing department in San Francisco, and this was they used rent control when rent control came in, and my boss's name was Mr. Lee, and he was Oriental, and people would call up and ask to speak to me, and so he referred to me as Mrs. C. My last name was Clayton at the time, and so they would come in expecting to find an Oriental lady, and they would ask me, where is Mrs. C? And it was kind of funny. And then I later left that job and went to work for Richard's clothing store, a man's clothing store, that because of the war, they put in a woman's department in order to have some customers.
In 1943, I was teaching in the west end of the San Fernando Valley in a school where all the students were Hispanic except for one Indian. It was not considered to be negative to have a segregated school at that time, and there were literally no facilities for them to be sent to. Two of my students were ones that should have been in special education, but there was no special education. And I was living in a fun place to live, actually. My husband and I were renting a place up on Torreyson above Mulholland Drive, and our next door neighbor was Errol Flynn, so it was a real joy to go to the mailbox. And he was truly gorgeous, notorious and gorgeous. But that was about the time that, because I was expecting, we decided that we needed to buy a place. So we bought a home out in Brentwood, about 4 miles west of UCLA. And the reason my husband was there was that he was not in the Army. An accident to one of his eyes when he was a child prevented him going into the service. And actually 2 of his associates at Stanford were also visually impaired, and they referred to themselves as the 3 blind mice.
When I was in the tank corps, or tank division, I had a pretty smooth job. I was driving a commanding officer around, our commanding officer in the Jeep, driving him around. I was a chauffeur, I didn't have to do much hiking or walking, hard stuff. So it wasn't too bad,
In 1943, I was working for Healdsburg Piping Company, Healdsburg Concrete Piping Company.
Well, actually, this was a time when social programs really came to the fore, and the government was trying very hard to meet the needs of people. Women, of course, went into the workforce in great numbers. They worked in the shipyards in Sausalito, and they were making far better money than they'd ever dreamed they could make. And people worked around the clock. I don't think they thought too much about hours. It was just getting the ships built and out. And it changed the whole climate of the country, because you had blacks and whites working together for the war effort. And so that was a big change. And of course, there was a big change in the Army at that time too. And I think that the whole country was behind World War II. They felt we'd been invaded, and it was a whole different feeling from what we have today.
Okay, in 1943, the country was, everybody was eager to get the war over with, and they're trying to do everything to help. I wish there was people really good about it. you know, saving this and saving that and not complaining about it, you know. So I think the move is pretty good for the people with the war going on, you know, trying to get that war over with.
In 1943, during the war, the people were united and were backing the president.
The hardship in 1943, everybody helped each other.
Because of the war and the shortages, for instance, the gasoline was at a real premium, not in price, but in the amount you could have. So you just didn't take off on trips or things of that sort. And we used to take this streetcar or buses out to Golden Gate Park. And I guess one of the most horrifying things to me was that I set my son down on the grass, and he was still a baby, and he just screamed bloody murder. His feet had never touched grass before. And I suddenly realized that there were certain hardships in living without a car and living in San Francisco. But probably the greatest hardships were just not having enough sugar, not having enough meat. I can remember standing in line like 2 hours in order to buy meat, and then when you got up to the counter, all they had left was something like brains that nobody would eat, or I can remember having a man standing in line in the chauffeur's uniform in front of me one day and buying the last of all the hamburger that was in the case. He had enough coupons for it, and then walking out and getting into this limousine and driving away. So there were inequities, but by and large, people did have to share.
So I was not experiencing a lot of hardship in this. I had been close to it in the matter of stamps and so forth, food stamps, when I worked at the school and was helping people get their stamps there, so I was aware of it. But not being anybody who ate sugar and getting gasoline stamps because of my husband's position, we weren't sweating it like a lot of people were, really. And it's not that I was callous about it, and certainly we weren't show-offish about it as far as driving is concerned, and we were careful about where we drove. But I can't say that I had any hardships on account of it at all.
In World War II, I lost a couple of friends of mine, real good friends. And that was one of the saddest parts, you know, and I come home, you don't get to see them anymore, and we're pretty close friends, you know. And it kind of hurts at that time. But then they're saying that's war, you know. Yeah.
During World War II, it was hard for people to get food. You had to have food stamps. And there was a concentration camp, I believe it was down around Windsor someplace, and there was a lot of Japanese there in the camp. And I remember hearing about them complaining about the ham and the bacon was too fat. And they took bulldozers and dug large holes and buried it. Or the people in town couldn't buy that meat in the butcher shop unless they had a food stamp.
The hardship in 1943, everybody helped each other.
In terms of any people you have among your loved ones who are now in the military, it is so important to maintain contact. We now have not only the business of mail, but email is so important. And I guess you can even send your photos by that method now. I'm not hip on that, but I mean, I understand it can be done. And so important to let them know that your thoughts are with them all the time in whatever way that you can do so creatively.
I would say to give those soldiers a lot of support, really get behind them, and always send them stuff if you can and stuff. It was a great thing receiving something when you're in the service. Somebody send you something, it was good. So I think that would really helps. Yeah, a little closeness to home that way. Yeah.
You asked what advice I'd give to people with family in the military. If it was me, I would say a prayer for them every night.
And so little things really disturbed me terribly. I'd never seen children scratching around in garbage pails, and all of this was pretty horrifying.
One of the things I remember truly about 1936 was the impact that FDR had. My grandfather listened to all his radio speeches. We listened to, and because of my own problems with polio, I felt a certain relationship to him. Actually, certain inspiration from what he had accomplished after having had a severe polio. I myself had restorative surgery in 1932, 33, and 34, so I went back to school each fall, initially in a wheelchair.
In World War II, I lost a couple of friends of mine, real good friends. And that was one of the saddest parts, and I come home, get to see them anymore, and we're pretty close friends, And it kind of hurts at that time. But then they're saying that's war,
I remember my mother had a pot of beans on the stove every day, and she made homemade bread, and there were men coming to the door begging for something to eat. They were hungry, and she never turned anybody down. Sometimes the freight train would come into town, and I'd count 60 and 70 men up on top of loads of lumber. And if the train stopped at the depot, they'd come uptown begging for food to eat. They'd want to do a little job for something to eat. We always felt sorry for them. My family never turned anybody down.
But that was one of the days that when I went to work for him, during the Depression, I got 40 cents an hour. And then the Depression come, he said, I can't pay over 25 cents an hour. So that was it.